And let's get started. We are ready to discuss how to reimagine communities, and we have wonderful experts to really help us begin and think about this conversation. The notes for this session really pointed out the enormous demographic shift that we're going to see over the next maybe 50 years, where another billion people will get added to the world population. And a lot of that growth, much of that growth, is going to happen in urban areas. And if you think about it this way, about a third of the infrastructure that will need to be built has not even been built or imagined yet, and another third of the infrastructure that's already here will need to be completely reconfigured and redesigned. So the issue of reimagining what a sustainable, economically sustainable, physically, geographically sustainable, and socially sustainable community looks like is a very important topic indeed. And it will happen, these demographic pressures, in the context of climate change pressures as well. That no matter what we do with regard to mitigation, and those efforts will become increasingly important, adaptation to the climate change that has already occurred must be built into imagining the natural and built infrastructure that we're going to talk about today. It's true that the most vulnerable populations live in the most vulnerable places, and that will become increasingly true given the effects of climate change. So this is a key panel to begin the conversation. We have several panels actually taking different components of this, but we have a very exciting group with us to talk about it. So you have a bit of their resume. Albi Bocanegra leads an initiative for MasterCard that now has about 330 cities globally, and NGOs and academics really coming together to work on these issues. And Albi has a great prior career in city government, both in New York and in San Francisco. We have Tony Cho, who is an entrepreneur and developer par excellence, who thought about sustainability and climate change before many have, and certainly is an icon in the development community in terms of thinking about what sustainable communities look like, and not only climate change sustainability, but how you build those communities towards social and economic progress and get more bang for the buck so that you're accomplishing multiple goals and at any single time. And I think that's a fascinating way to think about it. And Martha Schwartz, on my right, who is a distinguished professor at Harvard University and a world-renowned landscape architect and planner, and has been thinking about these issues again and teaching and working on these issues for a very long time. So maybe we can get started. And again, I'm not going to go around the panel. I'm really going to ask them to jump in when they feel like this is a good question for me to really talk about my issues. So what do you think when we talk about a sustainable community or a thriving community? What does that mean to you? What are the optimal ingredients of that? And do we see any examples or just some green shoots in places that people could understand and make more tangible that concept? Who'd like to grab that one?
Maybe I'll
Sure.
Yeah,
Go for it.
I'll go first. No pressure. Yeah, I mean, to me, just thinking about it from as a technologist and from a technology perspective, but also like a human-centered technologist, is it really kind of revolves around the resident. And I think, cities are closest to the resident, and they are responsible. They are the stewards of their well-being, but they're also the stewards of the well-being of the environment and how it's built out. So I think, to me, sustainability or a sustainable city would be one that starts at the community level and really not just models behaviors and builds and creates a built environment that's sustainable, but also rewards behaviors from residents. And I think, it's a behavioral modeling kind of concern, is how do you incentivize people to have sustainable behaviors? And so for me, when I'm thinking about it and talking about it with cities, that's what I'm talking about, is how are we incenting people to act sustainably and behave sustainably. And we'll build it, but how do we ensure that everyone's taking advantage of it and modeling the behaviors that we want for our residents? And so that's my lens. Obviously, there's different perspectives, but that's what I think about.
Tony, you have, you've done this. You also have investors, and we have a lot of investors in this audience. So what do you want as a developer and as an investor people to think about when they think about the kind of work that you're really promoting?
So I really believe that the triple and quadruple bottom line outcomes within real estate developments are actually going to be more profitable than the alternative. And I think we're in this seismic shift around what are the failings of capitalism, because they're not accounting for social or environmental issues which are going to essentially collapse our entire society. So I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that we have this confluence of issues and they're affecting the most vulnerable people. So I think there is an alignment of interest, if we're focusing on the underserved communities and creating resiliency and creating sustainability, because we need to rapidly prototype these solutions. In the next 30 years, the built environment will double or triple in size. And someone asked me a very poignant question earlier this week. They asked me, do you believe what will the population be in 2100? Will it be the 11 billion or 12 billion that's forecasted, or will it be 5 billion because of all these catastrophic events that will happen? This is a very important discussion to talk about. And I think we've kind of passed the point of no return in some regards, but that doesn't mean that we should give up hope or that there aren't solutions. So going back to your questions on resiliency and what do thriving communities look like, this is where you're elevating all members of the community. You're increasing home ownership. You're increasing financial sustainability and literacy within those communities. You're increasing education. You're providing more jobs and opportunity. And I think the most thriving communities are diverse communities of different socioeconomic and different backgrounds. And there was a recent study at Harvard that showed that if you combine people of lower economic backgrounds with people of higher economic backgrounds, it helps lift them out of those situations. So creating these separate communities where the rich are here and the poor are here doesn't work. It hasn't worked, and we need to change the model. So I really think the cities of the future will be diverse in every aspect, and it is the responsibility of those who are more well-off and who are more stable to help provide resilience for the rest of the communities, because we're going to go through a very tumultuous time.
I think that's critical. There was a study a few years ago that showed for children growing up, zip code is destiny.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the implications of that and how we can think about effecting transformations that break out of that, what seemed to be such a lockstep future. So far, Martha, we've talked about the social part of this. You've worked so much on design and sort of geospatial engineering, and you're right at the heart of some of these new technologies. But I think to Tony's point, you're worried about the climate change and all of the changes that have occurred so far, with maybe more attention on mitigating future than responding to what's already happened. So maybe you can jump in here and talk about that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and you can shut me down if I keep, going on and on about it. But I think that when we're talking about what we're going to be doing and what we're going to be providing and how we're going to be making money and blah blah blah, how we're going to develop, the background to all of this is climate change. That is the background, and I think that not to really understand where we are in climate change right now is a real mistake in terms of what we're thinking about doing. We have to understand that the climate is going to pretty much create the cards that we're going to work with. I mean, every city, every place around the world has different kinds of impacts of climate change in the first place. So we have to understand what each city is going to have to do and how it's going to have to build and design itself depending on where they are. Mm-hmm. But I mean, most people don't understand where we are in climate change. Most people really don't. And that, I think almost everybody thinks that if we were to get to the 1.5 Paris Agreement, that everything would be okay. But it turns out that that's not, scientifically, that is not the case at all. That the world is going to continue to heat up for decades. And I could go on and on.
But what are the best adaptation strategies given that fact?
Best adaptation strategies?
When we're doing urban planning and urban
Well,
design and development.
I would say that what we are going to need to deal with the impacts of climate change is to actually depend on the urban landscape, the ground, the soil. This is what we're going to need. We're going to have to integrate these ecological systems into our cities because right now, countries are hoarding their food now because climate change is impacting agriculture in the global south. And that's where a lot of food comes back to us as well. But of course, economies are tanking because they're not able to provide food for themselves now and in the future. So we're going to have to be thinking about cities, about how to actually make our cities more self-sufficient because countries are doing that. China is doing that. They're smart. We're not so smart here. But we're going to have to be more self-sufficient, and cities are too. So we're going to need the urban landscape to be able to deal with flooding so that the water can go down into the ground and replenish our aquifers because we need the water. We're going to have to plant more trees because urban heat island effect is the most dangerous of all the climate impacts. We need to have more greenery. We need to actually support our urban biodiversity. Remember, if biodiversity is tanks and it's 60% tanking, we depend on biodiversity. We're at the top of the food chain. We are useless in terms of nature, but if we lose our biodiversity, we cannot survive. And right now, the ocean's biodiversity is tanking, and the ocean provides 80% of our oxygen. We have to get real, everybody, in terms of what we're going to need. But cities
Let's
definitely
stay
are
on
going to need
cities
that.
for the moment.
Yeah.
Are there other city-based interventions based on the fact that a great deal of climate change has already occurred?
Definitely. So I just wanted to rewind for 2 seconds and just kind of connect the dots on something that Tony said and both Martha said. Tony made a really great point about things that we can provide as people who have been put in a position to provide certain things for residents. And I think one of those things is access. I think it's not about, charitable contributions. I think it's more about providing people access because the next great urban planner and the people that start thinking about how we are going to kind of slow down climate change are probably living in some of these urban communities now. And so providing that kind of access to resources, technology, et cetera, could develop the potential, future thinkers that are going to start planning out cities a little bit more thoughtfully. There's a lot of things that are happening, around communities that both touch on taking care of our earth, but also using technology and using resources. I know there's like great composting programs here in New York where they've taken, housing communities, they've created a composting program leveraging new technologies, and number one, it creates great behaviors in those communities because people start to compost and start to, produce less rubbish. But also, the local community is learning how to use data, learning how to use technology, and so they're creating like an ecosystem within some of the housing communities that are here. But there's so much more that we could do, but I think that's a really good model of how you take the bottom-up approach and look at the communities, start there, and scale that out, depending on the city size. I'm sure that you could touch a lot, but I think it all starts with access, is giving people access to the tools they need to be successful.
And a sense of agency, I would think. That is, this access and then knowing that there are things I can really do to determine my future.
Agency is very important, but I want to go back to what Martha said, and think if anything we learned from the pandemic is that we need to be self-sufficient. Cities, communities, rural and urban, but we need to focus on urban because these are the city centers where the populations are going to be, and this is where it all happens, and we need to build resilience. We need to be growing our own food, producing our own energy, building financial health and resiliency within those communities because we are going to all experience at any level. None of us are exempt from what's going to happen in the upcoming years
Exactly.
because of the climate disaster that is happening and all the migration from climate change. And we see what's happening on the energy side with the Russian-Ukraine conflict and war that's happening, and how it's, affected Europe disproportionately to other places who are so much more dependent on other nations. So I think eliminating the supply chain is extremely important. Producing your own food, rewilding our cities, bringing biophilic design into everything that we do, reducing and eliminating the heat island effect, and making our cities more resilient, and particularly the most vulnerable communities, because those are the ones that are disproportionately impacted by that. Leveraging technology and all this fintech innovation with blockchain to create equity within these communities, different models of ownership and different economic models, where it's not just one or single entities owning large chunks of communities, but all of us participating. And as they say, a rising tide really raises all of the people within that community, and that's involved in creating from all the food deserts and all of the communities we work into food forests, and really kind of just reimagining what we're doing. I live in one of the most vulnerable places in the world susceptible to climate change and sea level rise, Miami. You do as well, and we have the largest amount of wealth transfer in human history over the last 24 months. People have no regard. I mean, insurance premiums will double potentially in some parts of Florida, flood insurance, and people are not paying attention to that narrative because it's high net worth who can afford to relocate. Well, 90% of the world's population can't afford to relocate. So how are we going to manage that refugee crisis? Today we have 60, 70 million refugees around the world. We'll have 300 million in the next 10 years, and we'll have 1 billion potentially, in the next 30 years. This is a massive, massive shift globally that people, I don't think they realize what's coming. And we have to prepare, and we have to rapidly prototype solutions.
Absolutely.
And we need to invest heavily in innovations in the built environment. We invest 1% in the construction industry. In technology, they invest 15%. Why are we not investing 30% in the biggest lever to combat climate change? So I think we're just wasting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I have a couple things to add to what we could be doing in cities. Now, number one, most of our infrastructure is so old. Here in New York, it's 100 years old, and even New York can't get the money to actually repair it. But there's new micro infrastructures that are being developed, and we're going to need to do that, to use that. And we're going to also, you talked about communities. We're actually going to have to create communities again. And there's an idea of the 15 or 20-minute city,
Right.
where
The walkable city.
the walkable cities. And Paris is doing this. Let's see, in Spain they're doing it. There are different, and even the United States, even New York tried to do this once, but the idea where people are going to be living in neighborhoods where it's walkable, you can get what you need in a very short area of time, but it also means that you can come together as a community when the shit hits the fan, and you can work together to do that. Now, the other thing...
We are out of time.
Oh,
so
okay,
you have
sorry.
the very last sentence,
Wow, that was short.
but make it short.
Encore.
one of the most important things that will help to transition our cities is future mobility. We get the cars off the street. We actually take care of the right-of-way in cities, and we can plant forests in there. We can really change our cities by getting the cars out of our city.
Yeah, re-engineer the cities for humans and not for cars.
Exactly.
And reduce
Amazing
carbon
ideas, a lot of innovation going on, both technological, but also just
Social.
great imagination kind of innovation, and many, many investable opportunities if they're the right ones. Thank you.
Thank you.